Thank you, Sumitra. Thank you so much. It is a great honor and a pleasure to be here with this wonderful network of people today. I just want to say namaste and assalamu alaikum to each and every one of you. This is a pleasure. What I'm going to do is give a brief overview of the field that we call climate restoration, the climate restoration field. Climate restoration is a term that actually describes the job we must do if we are to survive as a species. Literally, it's that dire. We face, as we all know, and look at the scene behind me, I put that up just to shock and alarm us, and to remind us that indeed, this is not a game. This is not something we can hold off on any longer. It's something we should have been deeply engaged in 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, and we as a species failed to do so. So now we're actually facing a crisis. Fortunately, it is a crisis with solutions, but those solutions can be delayed not a moment longer. We must act. And if we don't act, our children and our grandchildren will face a very, very uncertain future. In fact, from my perspective, a terrifying future. I have 4 little grandchildren, and I don't want them ever to know that we even had such a crisis, that their ancestors were so foolish as to allow this to happen. So the climate restoration solution strategy, and it's not a single strategy. Mr. Elon Musk recently put out a $100 million offer.
Andrew, your microphone went mute for a moment. You'll need to fix that. And Philip and Peter, thank you for having your cameras on. It's nice to get a little feedback from some faces that are there. Peter, pull your camera down just a little bit so we can see more of you.
Who?
Peter.
Peter.
There he goes. Beautiful. Go ahead, Andrew. I'm sorry we missed you.
Wadhams. Oh, Professor Peter Wadhams. Hello, sir. It is such an honor to be on this.
And thank those of you who are sharing your video. It helps a lot for speakers to be able to see your eyebrows raised and your head shaking when things don't go well. Andrew, your microphone went off again, and I don't know why.
And I didn't touch it. So yes, let me know. And I'm now learning that when it jumps, there's a little sign that comes up here. But so we're looking at the phenomenon of climate restoration. What are the solutions to the climate emergency we face? And I see it as a 3-legged stool. The solution has 3 legs. And if any one of those 3 legs is missing, what happens to a 3-legged stool missing a leg? It falls over. It does not succeed. It fails. We do not have the option of failure. It's just not even, we can't even consider that. So the first leg of the solution has to do, as everyone knows, with the mitigation of emissions. We must stop putting dangerous chemicals, greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere. I'm certain that everyone on this call knows that very, very well. The second thing we must do, it appears that we've put approximately, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we have emitted approximately 1 trillion tons, I've heard higher, I've heard 2 trillion tons, of carbon-based products, emissions, pollution into Earth's atmosphere, primarily carbon dioxide, the best known, but methane is another extremely dangerous chemical that is leaking out of fracking sites and on and on and on. We face extreme dangers here. We must proceed to remove carbon dioxide and methane from Earth's atmosphere as swiftly as possible. And shall I say, in the most practical way. In other words, that could be a terribly expensive thing to do unless we look at that trillion tons of carbon as an opportunity, as a business opportunity. If we look at it as though we are miners, there's an organization called air miners. They go mining in Earth's atmosphere and remove CO2 and do intelligent things with it, profitable, valuable things. We can create products from that trillion tons of carbon. In fact, we can replace the concrete, the steel, and the aluminium industries with the carbon in the atmosphere. That's a big statement, happens to be true. And both of those legs of the stool I have thus far mentioned are essential, but insufficient in my opinion. There's a third leg, and that third leg is called SRM. You may or may not know that abbreviation for solar radiation management. Because carbon dioxide and the emissions we've just mentioned are not the problem. They may be the cause of the problem, but they're not the problem. The problem is, and we all know this, the problem is global warming. Our planet is heating up, overheating. So we have to reverse that. We have to find a practical, affordable way of reversing the ever-increasing temperature of our planet. And we can do that by solar radiation management. This is a very controversial subject because many of the proposals, from my perspective, are foolish and dangerous experiments that we have no way to control, such as pumping huge amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere and on, emulating volcanoes. So we have these three aspects to look at. We're not going to look at the first one. We already know that. We're going to look at the second one, which is the removal. Well, we're actually going to go into the subject of regenerative agriculture. Regenerative agriculture, of which my colleague Bill Tooley here is a master. He's an inventor. He has an extraordinary system that he has developed over the past, 30 or 40 years, I think, with his older brother who's now passed away. And in a moment, I'm going to hand it over to Bill. His program actually does a number of things, including minimizing the amount of toxic chemicals and greenhouse gases going into Earth's atmosphere while providing significant benefits to businesses, to investors, and to local communities. So let's start there, Bill. Does that make sense?
That's just fine, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Let's go into, I would like to introduce Bill Tooley and his extraordinary system.
Andrew, thank you. And Sumitra, thank you for the invitation here. And thank you to those of you who have turned on your cameras, because it, as I mentioned earlier, it helps a lot. Andrew's perspective on the three-legged stool of our problem is excellent. One of the themes that I will be returning to, but I want to give it to you right up front, is that whatever we do, whichever leg of the stool that we attack, that we attempt to accomplish, has to be fundable. It has to be supportable. It has to be affordable. I learned this in the very early stages of our efforts with agriculture. We knew 15 years ago, 20 years ago, that agriculture was contributing a great deal to the carbon in the atmosphere because of the methods of farming being used, and that these methods had to change. Well, of course, changing the methods of farming is the specialty that I will talk to you a little bit about, not more than you might be interested in, but we can get back together at any time and continue the conversation. However, that was not enough. Reducing the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere from agriculture did not remove the carbon that was in the atmosphere already, the second leg of the stool. And therefore, we moved on to saying, how can we adjust our approach to agriculture so that we're not just reducing the amount of carbon entering the atmosphere, but also removing, on balance, removing more carbon than we introduced. But the third component, the component about solar management, is not something that we could attack directly. And Andrew and I think on two sides of the question all the time, and we meet on the third side. How do we also do this? So to not delay this longer, what we discovered is that the carbon entering the atmosphere from farming practices, and I'm speaking primarily of chemical industrial farming practices, not the smaller scale organic or the village farming practices that have been practiced forever on the earth. And in looking at the chemical industrial farming practices that have taken over the majority of agriculture, we discovered that the use of fertilizer is the primary contributor to atmospheric carbon. And by that, I mean industrial fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, fertilizer which oddly enough is mined from the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen and then sold back to the farmer for use on his field. The problems of the farmer's use of industrial fertilizer is that it's too readily available. Among farming practices today, it has to be applied either in the late fall or the early spring when the crops are not on the field, because you can't go out and drive over crops while you're trying to put fertilizer in the ground, of course. And those weren't the practices that farmers were used to. What we needed to introduce were fertilizer sources and application methods that would allow farmers to fertilize their crop when the crop was hungry and needed to receive it. Therefore, the excess fertilizer that they put on under traditional practices in the spring and the fall would not convert to methane and immediately enter the atmosphere and become part of the problem. Farmers, of course, have some farmers have immediate access to the kind of fertilizer they need. We call it manure. But I'm going to say something astounding if you don't mind, and I hope you'll question me or raise your eyebrows. Manure is not fertilizer. Manure is the chemical source of organic fertilizer, but in the anaerobic manure form that it emerges from the animals that donate it to us. It is not available to the plants, and in fact, it is harmful to the plants. If I go and get a bucket of manure and I spread it on my wife's tomatoes, she will probably hit me with a rolling pin because her tomatoes will die. Farmers have learned this, and they know they have to transform manure into fertilizer. They have huge access to lots of it, but they didn't know how to use it. This is where my invention came in, and I'm proud of it. I'm also humble in the fact that it's a very obvious and very useful tool. For years and years and years, engineers have known, and when I say that, I mean decades, back to the 50s, engineers have known that if we convert manure by adding oxygen to fertilizer so that it can be available to the crops, it will no longer produce odor. The chemicals in it will no longer emit off into the atmosphere as methane, will no longer emit methane, and it will in fact be far less pathogen engaged than it is when it comes from the animal. But the conclusion drawn by the engineers back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and right up to the present is that aerobic treatment of manure is too expensive. Remember I said, cutting across all three legs of whatever we do, everything has to be affordable. So we began to search for methods that would make the aerobic transformation of manure into fertilizer affordable. And what we discovered is the natural focus on how manure transforms itself. It does so by extracting oxygen from the atmosphere. But the methods of storage in agriculture, and I hope this story isn't getting too detailed or too long for you, methods of storage that were being used in agriculture kept manure in its anaerobic, not in its oxygen positive form. As a result, it did not transform into fertilizer, and as a result, it was difficult, if not dangerous, to use. And as a result, it was emitting methane into the atmosphere, and as a result, the fertilizer value was getting lost, and on and on. And as in most systems, and agriculture is a system, as in most systems, when you get off on the wrong foot at the start, it cascades down through the entire process until you're losing value and spending money and producing products that are not appreciated. Why do I say that? Because the products of chemical industrial agriculture today are low in nutrient density. The example being that a bushel of corn today, a bushel of corn in the past was always rated at 65 pounds in weight. Today, a bushel of corn weighs 59 pounds. Something is missing. And what's missing are those exact nutrients that come out of the soil that are not nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the chemical fertilizers that we put on. They are the micronutrients that are there. And there's a great deal of discussion today about the fact that the hidden hunger that we all experience at some level or other, but that most people in the world experience at a very high level, the hidden hunger causes them to eat more because they're not getting the micronutrients that their body needs to build itself. As they eat more, they put on weight, but it doesn't help them because the micronutrients are missing. Where do those micronutrients come from? They come from the soil. Why are they not getting them in the farming processes today? I'm speaking to you from Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the Pilgrims landed 400 years ago last year. And the topsoils across America in those days were on average 18 inches. Those 18 inches of good organic base that plants could draw from. Today, the average topsoil is under 6 inches, which is the minimum limit that crops can grow and produce nutrient-dense material. That's why the bushel of corn does not weigh as much as it does. That's why Americans are grossly overweight, more than 40 or 50% of them, because the food they're getting off their grocery store shelves have calories and carbohydrates and energy, but that energy isn't being converted to anything except fat, and they don't have the micronutrients in them. So we have this huge hidden hunger, and the term I use for it, many people use for it, is that obesity today is now the new starvation. When you look at me and you see that I've put on weight, you need to be sympathetic. I'm starving. That's the problem. So how does this all come back to climate change? Well, until the farmer starts to use organic fertilizers that contain micronutrients so that our products can feed us, the farmer is not going to be able to supply the crops we need, and the micronutrients in his manure will be stored in our atmosphere as carbon-based products and cause problems. So what we did was to put together a system whereby the farmer could compost his manure. And you might say to yourself, that sounds easy. It's not. Composting solid products is a very energy intensive and very discipline intensive process. But most farmers in North America and elsewhere, most large scale farmers, and that's what I'm talking about today. We can talk about small scale at another time. But the real problem is the large scale farmers who store their manure do so in a safe lagoon or pond lined by clay so that it can't leak out and leach into the earth. And they're doing a very, very good job of that. However, they're keeping it in its anaerobic state, and it's contributing methane to the environment that we're all struggling to overcome. And all that methane contains the fertilizer that will drive the crops. And so they're causing their own fertilizer product to become less and less valuable and to become less and less useful, because taking anaerobic manure out to the field is a very risky process and has to be done at certain times of the year, depending on the seasons. So you're learning an awful lot about agriculture this morning. And if you start getting too much, you can put your hand to your forehead like this, Peter, and just, I'll turn this back over. Joseph, thank you for the heads up sign. I do this. I did this to Andrew when I first met him, and I've done it to him more than once, because most of us do not have the systematic connection to how chemical industrial farming is affecting us. We also don't have a systematic insight into how that can easily be transformed. So to conclude, and it'll take 2 or 3 minutes for me to do this, as you now expect, having gotten to know me a little bit on the screen here. To conclude, what the farmer has to do is to compost his manure, but he's holding it in liquid form. So what I invented was what I might call a liquid composter. It's nothing more than a circulator that floats on the manure lagoon and turns the manure over and over constantly, 24 hours a day, to expose it to oxygen and sunlight the way it would normally be if the cows were walking out on the field and dropped a plop which broke open and the air would blow through it and the sun would shine on it. We're doing that for millions of gallons of stored manure in the farmer's lagoon. This is now a pot full of organic fertilizer with no methane being emitted to the atmosphere, and one other chemical which is being emitted that you may or may not know about, and it's not the point of our topic today, but it's very important. No ammonia. I didn't see any faces react when I said that word. No ammonia being emitted to the atmosphere. Ammonia, it has agricultural ammonia, we have now learned, is contributing to something like a $286 billion public health problem in North America alone, because it combines with other exhausts from electrical utilities and from transportation and forms particulate matter, PM 2.5. PM 2.5 is the cause of the increase in childhood asthma. It's the cause of the increase in elder emphysema and the early death that occurs. And it was being and is being contributed to not only by the livestock lagoons that farmers use to contain their manure, and that's a good system. It has to be contained. It can't be running all over the earth. But it's PM 2.5 is also caused by the methane that emerges from the overuse, the unintentional and unavoidable overuse of chemical fertilizer, nitrogen, from the factory. Because when that nitrogen enters the atmosphere, it sometimes enters as methane, but it also sometimes enters as ammonia. When that happens, we now spread air pollution over the surface of the earth that has an immediate, methane has a long-term climate change effect. That's what we're talking about today. But methane has an immediate health effect on your asthma or your emphysema or simply your lungs. All right. When we went there and discovered that we could prevent methane from entering the atmosphere, I knew that I was in the climate change reduction business. When we discovered that we were also preventing ammonia, I knew I was in the public health business, and I knew I had a message for farmers. The problem is that farmers didn't get the message. And the reason they didn't get the message, take this to heart. The reason they didn't get the message is not just that they had to learn a whole new way of farming, which their great-grandfathers knew, but their grandfathers and their fathers did not. But also, they had to afford a new method of farming. And until I could look them in the eye and say to them, you are paying too much for the fertilizer that you're putting on your fields, and the fertilizer you're putting on your field is destroying the topsoil that provides the micronutrients that your customers need. You are paying too much for farming. You need to use organic fertilizer for farming. And then I have to give him a product that he can use in his current system. What's his current system? His current system is huge tractors that go over large fields and that are watered by very big sprinklers. And aha, that's where we get to him. The material in his manure lagoon has always been a semi-solid, slurry-based material. When I say manure, I know you think of solid product, but the millions of gallons of manure on the face of the earth today are mostly not solid. They're mostly semi-solid or liquid. The problem is that liquid slurry in his lagoon is not transformed into fertilizer so that he could sprinkle it on his crops. What our circulators do, and they're very simple devices. And if you go to a website called The Expert Company, not the, just Expert Company, one word, .us, expertcompany.us. I see Joseph taking notes, and Peter and Philip, thank you. And Pauline, I see you taking notes too, that's appreciated. It's expertcompany.us as a website. It's not a very good website, I'm not proud of it, but there's a lot of information about what we're talking about there. You will see that these circulators are simple, basic devices that run unattended and on their own and compost the farmer's fertilizer into crop-ready, plant-available, pathogen-free, liquid, 99% true liquid fertilizer. So he can put it right through his sprinklers and right on his crops. When he does that, my theme has been affordability. When he does that, he gets 20 to 40% more crop because he can put it on when the crop is hungry. And if you put food in front of a crop when it's hungry, they will in fact grow more and produce more. He also is not overloading his soils and causing problems from that perspective. Okay, Andrew, I want you to stop me. And I see a beautiful image behind your head there. So my focus in this is on agriculture and what can be done in agriculture. But it's also that the theme of this is that three-legged stool has to have a connecting surface. The connecting surface of that three-legged stool image that Andrew gave us is the affordability of anything we do in any of the legs. If they're not affordable and they don't fit into the practices that people have become accustomed to, then that practice will not be, that leg will not be successful, that practice in that leg. So my whole purpose in being here is to simply say the word, is it affordable? Does it pay somebody for doing what you're doing? And if it is, great. Now all we have to do is teach them. If it isn't, let's think of something else. Andrew.
Thank you, Bill. Wonderful. I think everybody realizes that this is what Bill has just given a very brief introduction to, is a deep, profound subject that could actually transform global agriculture, could eliminate most or all of the problems that are created by contemporary agri-chemical business practices and farming practices. It's quite extraordinary. And Sumitra mentioned that I'm a filmmaker, and one of the recent film projects I did is that Bill and I took a road trip together to half a dozen or so of the 30-odd farms in the Midwest that he currently has his systems operating on. And it was amazing to go to these dairy farms, for example, and to learn that there are no odors, no aromas, that all of that stuff has gone. And standing on the edge of these formerly smelly brown lagoons full of manure, they were crystal clear. I expected to see fish swimming by. I could see 6 or 8 feet down into them. Quite extraordinary. So I just would recommend that people look up Bill Tooley, The Expert Company. Very interesting. I'm going to now jump to carbon capture, specifically the fact that we have this amazing resource of roughly 1 trillion, let's just call it a round figure, 1 trillion tons of carbon waiting for us in Earth's atmosphere. Thinking as miners, it's a mining opportunity. The resource is in fact free. It's right now right in front of each of us. We're inhaling it and exhaling it. It's called atmospheric carbon dioxide. And I started my science career at the age of 14 when I first encountered chemistry. And one of the very first things I learned in chemistry in a high school in South Africa, where I grew up, was a reaction between carbon dioxide, which was in a little canister, and sodium hydroxide, which was in the form of an aqueous solution, a water-based solution in a beaker. And we bubbled the CO2 through the solution, and the CO2, these large bubbles at the bottom, disappeared by the time they got to the top. And the lesson, as this little 14-year-old looked on in amazement, was that they disappeared completely because the carbon dioxide had reacted with the sodium hydroxide and formed sodium bicarbonate. And we ended up with a neutral solution of sodium bicarbonate. Now, if you just take just that, the very first thing I learned in chemistry, and apply that to countless cubic feet of air containing 415 or so parts per million of carbon dioxide, think of that at scale. Is that easy to do? It's not difficult to do. What would you need? Some kind of a sort of a little sprinkler system, waterfall, and the air is passing through it and reacting, and you've actually captured your carbon. You've turned it into sodium bicarbonate using that particular chemistry. And sodium bicarbonate, trust me, does not cause global warming. So if you could do that at scale, you'd end up with a massive pile of baking soda, the best known use for sodium bicarbonate. But baking soda, sodium bicarbonate, is a precursor compound for many, many other possible products that we can convert it into. We can convert it, or let's say we were going to looking for an end product in the form of limestone, calcium carbonate. We'd simply use a calcium chemistry. We could use various chemistries. There are at least half a dozen or more chemistries whereby we can capture CO2. So the big question, it's really not difficult to capture that. Our founding principles for the company was, okay, it's going to have to be profitable to investors. So we actually have to find ways to capture carbon and convert it into something marketable. There are a spectrum of strategies on that. We can make concrete. We can literally make synthetic limestone and capture carbon permanently in the form of concrete, which is never going to escape and never cause a problem again. We can convert it into fuels. But I have a problem with fuels is that most of the current strategies turning atmospheric CO2 into fuels are simply marketing them, turning them around, selling them to people, say the trucking industry or the airline industry, that will simply burn it and put it straight back in the atmosphere. That, my friends, is not our business model. Our business model, every molecule of CO2 we get our hands on is captured permanently, unless we convert it in the greenhouse behind me here into food. We do, in fact, greenhouses and plants, growing things, love carbon dioxide. So we do have to eat. We do have to feed our children. We do have to feed our animals. So we will indeed produce a lot of food, and that CO2 will eventually cycle back into the atmosphere. There's no way to avoid that I know. But if we turn it into fuel, this is a big building. It's a 45,000 square foot underground building. It's an acre. It's going to need heat in the wintertime. So it's simply design a heating system that does not emit CO2 into the atmosphere by circulating it on the spot, by recapturing the carbon immediately. That is not a difficult thing to do from an engineering standpoint. So circular economy, Bill was just talking about circular farming, circulating everything, recycling and recirculating the CO2 in our atmosphere in an intelligent way is entirely doable. Here's the thing I'm really interested in. If there's anyone on this call who knows how to do this, because I don't yet, we're speaking with Texas A&M University on the subject, there's a lot of interest, but can we take that 1 trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere, capture it, extract it, and convert it into carbon fiber composite materials for 3D printing? I know that's a mouthful, but in other words, can we turn it into a construction material to replace the steel industry? Peter Diamandis, you may or may not know of him, he's the founder of Singularity University, wrote a book on the subject. He believes, he calls it the carbon revolution. And I had been saying this for years before he wrote his book. So thank you, Peter, for giving us a great deal of credibility there. Point being, we can convert the CO2 into the atmosphere into a wide spectrum of useful, marketable, profitable products. And by so doing, we can be reaching our primary goal, which is reducing CO2. And at the same time, we can be making a profit because people need jobs. That's going to help economies. We're not going to spend 3% of gross domestic product doing this. We're going to make a profit doing it. And we're going to do it in an earth-friendly, community-friendly, distributed way. We're not going to create huge, ugly, noisy factories. And many of the systems that I have looked at are, in fact, huge, ugly, noisy factories. We're going to create distributed, localized, these buildings, it's called the Enviroplex, and it contains one of my inventions, which is called the carbon capture module. So it's got to be modular, it's got to be mass producible. And there's going to be, the vision is, there's going to be one of these buildings per 1 million of population. So if we're in Mexico City, we put a circle of 24 of these in a circle around Mexico City. They're giant air filters. They clean the air, they extract the particulate matter. People who live and work within those buildings are no longer breathing the pollution that Bill was just talking about and no longer having the health issues and the health expenses that is a result of current practices. So there's a lot that can be said about this. The idea is that this is something, you know the expression NIMBY, not in my backyard. Well, this is IMBY, in my backyard. People are going to want this. It's a community center, it's jobs, it's housing, it's whatever you need this building to do. It's simply a building. And we can use it for whatever humans use buildings for, but it does something buildings don't do yet. It extracts CO2 and other pollutants from Earth's atmosphere and emits it. And gradually, if there's no wind blowing, it gradually creates a dome of CO2-free, pollution-free air outside. But immediately inside, we're in a pure, clean place to live and work and go to school or whatever we're using the building for. It's called the Enviroplex. And if you go to, note the word I use, sacred. I believe we have a sacred duty to accomplish this. sacredearthenterprises.us. That's a website that will introduce you to this material. You can see a tower over on my other shoulder, that side. That's another solution. That's an energy battery. It's a water tower, as you find throughout the world of rural America in particular, where you have these water towers as you're driving along. It's related to that, but it does much more. It's a battery. It stores electricity by pumping water when there's plenty of renewable energy up into the tank and is released at night, or at times the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, and you can recover your electricity. That's one of many products, if you will, or parts of these integrated systems. One of the things we're developing. I'm going to jump now to solar radiation management, which has a very bad name. It's a no-no even to mention it. It's called geoengineering. It's dangerous, it's foolish, we're not going to do that. Friends, we have to do that, but we have to do it in an intelligent, controllable, harmless manner. Those three factors are essential, and it's not difficult to do. So one of the things we've been looking at, there's a Harvard professor, for example, who's getting quite a lot of traction on his idea, which involves putting a whole lot of mirrors out, floating them on the ocean and so on. I don't think it's practical at all. I think he has the right idea, but the wrong application. And then there's another professor at Stanford who's developing nanophotonic materials that can spectrally tune these potentially, he's not seeing it that way, but I'm seeing it that way, mirrors. So one of our new businesses is called spectral photovoltaics, and it has to do with the next generation of solar panel, which is not merely an electricity converter of light into electricity, but it's a mirror for carefully tuned frequencies of the infrared. It's a mirror for heat, but it's an absorber for light. And it's also translucent in its back because we're going to use it for large agrivoltaic projects, or what the Germans called Uber agriculture, which is where you grow your crops shaded by solar panels. So we're working on a real spectrum of possibilities here. The idea is that each of these enviroplexes land in your community and becomes a community center, in the sense that the community can look at it and we can look at you and we can say, okay, what does your community really need here? You need housing for your climate refugees. You need a place for the kids to go to school. Whatever it may be, we can provide that at the same time as the whole thing being an ever-evolving experiment in what we are going to do to succeed in this project called climate restoration. So my friends, I think that's a very sort of scattershot overview, but I'd like to turn it over to questions at this point. I'm just intuiting that it's probably a good time to do that. And Sumitra, may we pass this back to you and see what you think at this point?
What a wonderful talk and innovations and work you are doing, Andrew and William. Thank you very much for your enlightening talk. I am going to go over a few questions that came over. And the first question is, and I think opening up to both of you, whoever wants to take it, is Michael Mann and others believe that if we can get to net zero by 2050, warming will cease within a few decades. Could you please comment?
All right, so from my perspective,
Peter ought to answer this one.
do you want to do this one too? Did you say?
No, I said Peter ought to be answering this one as well.
So
right, that's true. Peter should answer.
I know. We've got the master president in the room, so we are blessed by his beaming in from Italy. And we'll see him a little later on the Healthy Climate Alliance call in a couple of hours. Treating the symptom, namely removing carbon dioxide and methane from the atmosphere, is a necessary but insufficient thing to do. Part of the reason for that is there's a tremendous lag. It has taken 200 years of the Industrial Revolution to reach the point we're at. If we were to stop all emissions right now, it's too late. If we were to extract huge amounts of CO2 and other pollutants from the atmosphere right now, that's actually a tricky thing to do because of the albedo effect. Some of this pollution is actually helpful in that it's deflecting solar heat from the planet. So these projections of such and such by 2050, et cetera, are interesting. I am personally not one who does those kinds of calculations, so I really have to defer to those who do, and bless you for doing it. But my attitude is at least we know a certain amount of what we have to do. So let's get to work. Let's get these things happening. Let's be capturing carbon. Let's be producing organic food. Let's be serving our local communities globally. Let's be helping countries to reach their SDG goals. This we can do. This we can be helpful with. And making a profit for now. I'm very happy for this to be a nonprofit venture, but my belief is that this is going to be a good investment, not only financially, but in terms of the future for our species. So I know that's not as direct as it could, but I just think the lag factor in this 2050 idea, if we can eliminate, I listened to the beautiful young Swedish girl, Greta, and she truly believes that all we have to do is change our ways and stop polluting. Not enough, sorry, it's just not enough. And at the government level, that is probably the consensus belief right now. All we're gonna do is stop doing that. Not true, my friends. It is much more dire than that. And I think Professor Wadhams would agree. Next question.
Yeah, I completely agree with you here.
Good.
That's one of the biggest dangers now in in trying to see what we must do is the assumption that all you have to do is to reduce emissions down to zero and everything's okay. But it's not, because there's the first of all the fact that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is already too high for a healthy climate. So even if we stop emitting, we've still got too much there, and it never goes away because carbon dioxide in the atmosphere stays around for thousands of years. It doesn't just disperse like maybe methane does by oxidizing. Carbon dioxide is there, and we have to stop putting it in. Obviously, that's one of the three legs. But we've also got to take out what's there now, and that's the thing that nearly everybody, including all the bureaucrats who design things like the Paris Climate Agreement, never understood. And sadly, actually, even Greta didn't understand it. But that was just she's got a long lifetime to learn. But the bureaucrats don't. They can inflict their views now.
Thank you, Peter. Just want to add that Pope is talking about taking out carbon these days. So it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, we have to do it, because if we design a way, for instance, air capture, if we don't reduce carbon emissions, we'd have to take out about 40 or 50 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year before we can even start to get carbon dioxide levels down. But if we can reduce our emissions, then our starting point is lower. We don't have to do so much before we can actually start to get CO2 levels down.
That's exactly the point of the three stools. Each of them is essential. None of them is sufficient unto itself. And if we can actually find a balance between those three, that stool, we can sit down comfortably on that stool and be safe for a long time. But right now we are unsafe.
So moving on to, we are running out of time. So moving on to, I mean, this is a very interesting discussion. We can have a long discussion just on this particular topic. But in the interest of time, I'll move on to the next question. Can Mr. Tooley please provide a reading source about the aerobic manure so I can learn more? Thank you.
The study done, partially funded by the USDA in 2009, was entitled Aerobic Manure Management and its et cetera. Let me go into my computer and bring up a link. I will put it in the chat window, and everyone can have it. I'll be right back.
Thank you, Bill. Next question, again to Bill. Are there enough manures from animals to serve farmers globally?
Not at this time. There's much more than is currently being used effectively, but there is not enough to provide the entire global needs. However, once farmers discover that going back, as Philip communicated with me, going back to the whole systems agriculture approach is actually more profitable, more affordable, easier than doing the things they're doing today. And their great-grandfathers did it in a more cumbersome manner. We can do it in a very scalable, very large-scale, very efficient manner. But going back to using transformed aerobic animal manures on their crops is much more profitable, much more sustainable, rebuilds their soils, rebuilds their nutrient density, and it will become automatic. As the saying goes, if you want to teach someone a new way of thinking, don't just sit there and talk to them as I'm doing now, but rather give them a tool, which is the invention that I created, the circulator, the use of which will cause them to say, now, how can I do this differently and how can I do this better? And they will, in fact, think differently. Buckminster Fuller.
Thank you, Bill. Our next question, and this is again the question of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. How much of the 35 gigaton carbon dioxide per year we are currently emitting could be reasonably expect to be able to capture and permanently sequester in long-lasting sellable product?
Well, that is purely a question of scale. One of our carbon capture modules might capture, shall we say, 1,000 tons of CO2 per year. One of them. That's not going to make the slightest difference. But once we have 10,000 of them running 24/7, 365 days a year, now we're looking at a major scaling factor. So really, it's a question. The reason we've done it this way is using a distributed system. We generate our own energy. We're not dependent on the grid. We are capturing carbon locally. We are creating businesses and jobs locally. And once we scale it, and there are many, many other projects in the works, our project can make a significant difference at scale. Obviously, when it's just one little team doing something, it's not going to be noticeable. So in terms of the gigatons per year, as Peter Wadhams just said, we must stop emitting that much every year, firstly. So we're electrifying, we're doing all the things we can think of at this point to slow down and stop the actual emissions. On the other hand, we must accelerate the capture. And it's purely a question of scale. Does that make sense?
Thank you. It does make sense. And I want to add that there is a little known product, or quite well-known product, is limestone. And that limestone, there's a huge demand. We use that for making concrete. It's a tremendous demand. And in limestone, 44% of limestone is carbon dioxide. So and this limestone, we can make it in a factory, and that's what Blue Planet is doing.
Exactly.
The company called Blue Planet. So because of the demand, if you can scale it, let us say we replace today's synthetic natural limestone with synthetic limestone, we'd be able to remove the carbon dioxide, that amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Exactly.
And it could be done profitably. And we have done the work on it, and we found it is quite profitable and generate good amount of return on it. I just wanted to add to that. Thank you. I think we're out of time. I don't see any more questions. So it's 11 o'clock my time, Eastern time, and maybe 9 o'clock your time, Andrew?
Yes.
Okay.
And look, my final message to all of you.
So I will give to you the final message if you want to say a few words, the final closure.
Go ahead, Andrew.
That very brief sentence on my screen: together we can restore Earth's climate. So I find that many of us are in our little silos, in our separate little realities with our separate little projects, and we must find a way to somehow to come together and to support. My belief is that we have to pull out all the stops and do everything. If so-and-so has an idea and he or she is passionate about it, support them. Let's do it. It may be the key, but there's probably not a single key. There are multiple keys to this crisis. And each of us needs to do our part, from the simple things we can do ourselves at home to supporting major projects such as the ones we're describing here today with Bill Tooley and myself and Sumitra and Peter. So thank you. It's been a delight.
Thank you, Andrew. For my part, For those of you, and there are some who have an interest in how agriculture plays into this three-legged stool, I'm available. I'm trying to be retired, but I'm unsuccessful at that. I'm happily unsuccessful at that. I keep getting called back into projects. And it adds meaning and value and enjoyment to my life. So please do not be hesitant at all to contact me directly by email, using my cell phone, whatever you wish. And Misha, thank you for thanking us for our work. Sumatra, thank you for having us here today.
Thank you, Andrew and Bill. What a wonderful presentation. We learned a lot. And please give them a round of applause.
Very kind of you.
And Peter Bottoms, thank you so much for your contribution. That was a priceless gem you dropped into the middle. Thank you, sir.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. It's great to have Peter on this meeting.
Oh,
now, go ahead, Peter. So now we'll move on to the closure, and our Vice President Chandan Bhattacharya will end with the vote. Chandan, over to you, Chandan. Chandan, you may be mute.
Okay. Hi. My respected distinguished speakers, honorable viewers, and the team attached with the webinar, Namaskar. I am Chandan Kumar Bhattacharya, Vice President of HCI. Today, once again, it is my proud privilege to propose vote of thanks on behalf of Healthy Climate Initiative Group in this special occasion, Carbon Capture, Regenerative Agriculture, and Solar Radiation Movement. I take this opportunity to express our full-hearted gratitude to respected speakers Andrew C. Bailey and William F. Tooley for the discussions they have made on a very important subject with the solution to the problem at this very appropriate time. Thank you for your answering questions to all our viewers. On the other hand, I have been very impressed and touched for the very good response and natural participation of people from all segments of the society in this online program. For that, you deserve a big round of applause. Lot of things are happening on the climate restoration. HCI is participating on some very reputed organizations with common objective. We request you all to join with us in the Healthy Climate Initiative Group. It will be great help for HCI as well as for the earth. I believe whatever works need to be done, whatever opportunity comes our way, whatever the way we have to share, this is the time, not tomorrow. Dear respected speakers, we hope to see you again in our program with more progress in the healthy climate movement. I thank to my president, Mr. Soumitra Das, for